The silent gun. The anomaly. Dr. Naila Rashid had spent 11 years studying moonquakes before she found something that shouldn't exist. It was buried in the seismic data from the Apollo-era sensors, old readings that NASA had digitized and forgotten in a public archive nobody bothered to check twice. A tremor from 1972, 3 kilometers below the lunar surface, propagating in a pattern no natural quake could produce. Perfectly symmetrical. Perfectly rhythmic. Like a heartbeat. She almost dismissed it as instrument error. Almost. But then she cross-referenced it against gravitational anomaly maps from the more recent Grail mission, and there it was again, a dense, artificial-looking structure sitting at the exact center of the moon, roughly the size of Manhattan, with a mass distribution that made no geological sense. Rock didn't arrange itself in nested spheres, layered like the world's largest matryoshka doll. She called her old colleague, Dr. Elias Cho, a planetary geophysicist who now worked, reluctantly, for a private space contractor. "I need you to look at something," she said. "And I need you to not tell your bosses yet." 3 days later, they stood together in her cramped office at the University of Karachi, staring at a 3D model rotating slowly on her monitor. The moon, hollowed out from the inside, veins of unnaturally uniform density running from the core to points just beneath the surface, dozens of them, spaced with mathematical precision. "It looks like wiring," Elias said quietly. "Or plumbing. Or a barrel," Naila finished. He looked at her. "You're not serious." "I didn't say I was serious. I said it looks like one." 2. What the rock remembers. They got funding, quietly, through a research grant that didn't ask too many questions, for a deep penetrating radar survey using an old lunar orbiter that had been sitting half forgotten in low lunar orbit, repurposed from a defunct communications mission. It took 4 months to get the imaging resolution they needed. For months of Naila barely sleeping, running simulations, trying to convince herself she was chasing a ghost. She wasn't. The images that came back showed something that no purely geological process could explain: a vast lattice of crystalline structure, distributed through the lunar mantle in a honeycomb pattern, converging at 31 points near the surface, each one aligned, with unsettling precision, toward a different region of Earth. 31, Elias said, staring at the printout. "That's not a coincidence number. That's a targeting number." Naila didn't answer right away. She was looking at the coordinates the convergence points aligned with when projected onto Earth's surface, projected as they would have been if you turned back the clock on both the moon's slow tidal locking and Earth's continental drift, some 60 million years. Every single one of them lined up with a known impact crater. Chicxulub, Poppyguy, Vrede Fort, sites already famous to geologists as the scars of ancient catastrophe, the kind blamed on asteroids. "They didn't fall," Naila whispered. "They were fired." 3. The man from nowhere. The knock on her apartment door came at 11 at night, 4 days after she'd submitted a cautious, heavily hedged paper to a peer-reviewed journal, a paper about anomalous internal density gradients, nothing more inflammatory than that, nothing about weapons or targeting arrays. She hadn't even mentioned the coordinate alignment. The man at her door was maybe 60, silver-haired, dressed like he'd stepped out of a diplomatic reception rather than a Karachi night. He introduced himself as Dr. Anton Voss, formerly of the European Space Agency, now representing what he called, with a thin smile, an informal international working group. "You should withdraw your paper," he said, once she'd let him in out of sheer bewildered curiosity. "Why?" "Because you're 70 years late, and you found something we've spent 7 decades trying to keep quiet." He told her, carefully, as though rationing the truth in doses he judged she could survive, that the anomaly wasn't new. American and Soviet scientists had both stumbled onto pieces of it independently in the 1960s, the strange resonance patterns from seismometers left by Apollo astronauts, and a Soviet lunar probe's gravimeter reading that had been quietly buried in an archive in Star City. Neither side had trusted the other enough to compare notes at the time, and neither had wanted the public to know that the moon, humanity's oldest, most sentimental symbol of peace and romance, might be an artifact. Not a natural satellite. A remnant. Remnant of what? Naila asked. "That," Voss said, "is what we still don't fully know. But we know what it did. 66 million years ago, something used it. And it hasn't fired since." 4. The builders. Voss showed her data that had never been published, decades of quiet analysis by a rotating cast of scientists sworn to a secrecy so old it predated most modern national governments. The picture that emerged was staggering, assembled from isotope ratios in lunar core samples, from the resonant ringing the moon still did after every meteor strike, a phenomenon Apollo astronauts had noted with unease, calling it eerie, unnatural, the moon behaving like a bell rather than a rock, and from the strange crystalline lattice Naylor herself had rediscovered. The moon, they believed, was not formed in the conventional way, not a chunk of Earth blasted into orbit by a Mars-sized impactor, as the textbook said, though that origin story wasn't entirely wrong either. Something had arrived not long after that catastrophic collision and made use of the resulting debris field, using it as raw material to construct, over what must have been generations, perhaps millennia, an object of almost incomprehensible scale and purpose. A weapon. Or a shield. The two possibilities were not mutually exclusive. The internal lattice functioned, as far as anyone could determine, as an energy accumulator, drawing on some combination of tidal stress, solar wind, and processes still not understood, storing power across geological timescales, and releasing it in directed bursts through the 31 convergence points. Each burst manifested on Earth as what looked, to any observer without deep time perspective, exactly like a meteor impact. Devastating, planet-altering, and, crucially, deniable. A weapon that left no fingerprints, only craters that any future civilization would blame on the indifferent universe. Who built it? Naylor asked. And who were they fighting? Voss's expression, for the first time, cracked into something like genuine uncertainty. We don't know if the war is over. The heartbeat returns. The reason for his visit, he finally admitted, was not academic courtesy. It was urgency. 6 weeks earlier, a global network of gravitational wave detectors, instruments built to catch the death spirals of distant black holes, repurposed quietly for lunar monitoring after the Cold War discoveries, had picked up the same rhythmic tremor Naylor had found in the old Apollo data. Except this time, it wasn't a fossil in the archive. It was live. The moon's ancient heartbeat had started again. Naylor felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though nothing in the room had moved. How long until? We don't know if it's charging for a discharge, or waking up for some other reason entirely. We don't know if there's still an intelligence in there making decisions, or if it's an automated process with no one left to answer to. We don't know who the targets would be, if there are new targets, or whether this is simply, I hate this word, but there isn't a better one, malfunctioning, like an old engine sputtering back to life after 70 million years of dormancy. So why come to me? Because you found it independently, from public data, in 4 months, working alone. That terrifies us more than the moon does. If a university researcher in Karachi can rediscover humanity's oldest secret with an old NASA archive and a laptop, then the secret isn't a secret anymore. It's a matter of time. And we would rather have you working with us than publishing alone into a world that isn't ready, and that some very frightened, very powerful people might decide needs a different kind of ending than the truth. 6. What Naylor chose. She thought about her withdrawn paper, 3 cautious, defensible paragraphs sitting in a journal's peer review queue, days away from the sort of quiet publication that changes careers but not history. She thought about the 31 dark points still buried under lunar regolith, patient as they had apparently always been. She thought about the astronauts, 40 years dead, who had felt the moon ring like a bell and never understood what they'd woken. I'm not going to disappear into your working group, she told Voss. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't find this. Then what do you propose? The truth, eventually, but not delivered as a bombshell. Delivered as science. Slowly. Carefully. With evidence people can check for themselves, so it isn't just one more conspiracy theory nobody has to believe. And in the meantime, she looked at the rotating model still glowing on her screen, the pale sphere with its secret architecture of light and dread. We find out if it's still armed. And if it is, we find out who it's still pointed at. Voss studied her for a long moment, the way a man might study an equation he suspected had just gotten harder rather than easier. You understand, he said quietly, that if you're right, this changes the answer to a very old question. We always assumed we were alone up there, looking up at an empty sky, wondering if anyone was ever coming. Naylor looked past him, out through her narrow window, to where the moon hung low and silver and utterly familiar over the rooftops of Karachi, the same moon that had guided sailors, inspired poets, been blamed for madness and worshipped as a god, for the entire span of recorded human history. Someone already came, she said. They just left the gun in orbit and never came back for it. Outside, 700,000 kilometers away, deep in the dark honeycomb heart of that ancient, patient machine, something that had waited 66 million years for a reason no living mind remembered pulsed once, faint, rhythmic, and, for the first time in an age older than the dinosaurs, listening. The end.